Members, I'd like to reconvene the House Environment and Natural Resources Policy and Finance Committee. Members, we have 2 amendments left to adopt for Representative Torkelson's House File 390. The first amendment is we're going to take them in the order of A8 and then A10. There's some folks here for the A8. So if I'm not mistaken, I believe the A8 is Representative Fabian. Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciated the work that we did in committee on this. When it started out, it was going to be pretty narrow as to who could get the funding, and we were able to get it changed so it was going to go a lot more around the state. To finish, I'd like to move this amendment, the A8, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Representative Fabian.
Thank you. And then on line 22.17, remove the words the pollution control and insert natural resources. And on line 18, remove delete agency. So it winds up just shifting it from pollution control agency to DNR.
Thank you, Representative Fabian. Do either one of the agencies want to testify, or do any members have questions? Representative Hansen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I heard you say we were going to adopt the amendments. I thought we might consider them before we adopted them, but I'll just want to make sure my hearing was right. And I would like to consider the agencies to get on the record and say what they think about this. So.
Okay, thank you. Representative Hausman.
Well,
Representative Hausman.
My interest would just be, and I'm assuming maybe the author or someone, because this is the work of the LCCMR, why did they do it this way? Do we know what their, presumably they had a reason?
Representative Hausman, both the author of the amendment and the author of the bill serve on LCCMR. Which author were you referring to?
Anyone who might know.
Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, like I said, in committee, when we first started with this particular item, it was going to be very narrow in that, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, and Rochester or something. And of course, some of us who are from greater Minnesota had some concerns about that, so we did get it changed to where it is now. It was a proposal that was brought forth by MPCA, but I just think that in this case here, I think that DNR has already demonstrated the capacity and a willingness to do these types of projects, and I just think it fits into their purview.
Anything to add, Representative Torkelson, also a member of the LCCMR?
Thank you, Mr.
Torkelson.
Chair. Representative Hausman, as I recall, and my notes are left in my office. I didn't grab them on the way down, but I know that this project did not have full support. I know, in fact, I rated it as 0 on a 0 to 10 scale. So there was many questions about the project as it went through our process, and as Representative Fabian has discussed, there's some misgivings about the way it was set up. There's some good elements to it. We just feel that DNR is probably more appropriate agency for tree planting than the PCA.
Representative Hausman, follow up?
No, I just, as I read it, it wasn't clear why it would have initially been put under PCA, so I thought maybe there had been some discussion about that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Representative Hausman. Why don't we have the PCA come down first, as long as it seems like they're one of the ones that are involved here and have had questions asked. Representative Hansen, did you have anything in particular you wanted? Ms. Gauthier, then just remember to identify yourself for the record when Representative Hansen asks a question. Excuse me, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Gauthier. So this is a pollution control agency initiated project that you prepared and went through the process. Is that correct?
Ms. Gauthier.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hansen, yes, that's correct. The PCA went through the LCCMR's process with this proposal and brought it to, in a coalition with a number of other groups, brought it to the LCCMR. And our interest in it is from a clean water standpoint. More urban forestry impacts clean water. Makes
Representative Hansen.
And Mr. Chair and Ms. Gauthier, so we're one of those cooperative folks that you were working with, the Department of Natural Resources?
Ms. Gauthier, could
Thank you,
you
Mr. Chairman.
state your name and position for the
I'm so
record?
sorry,
No, that's
Mr.
okay. Go
Chairman.
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Greta Gauthier, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Mr. Chairman and Representative Hansen, yes, we are cooperating in this proposal with the DNR and also with the Department of Health, in addition to other non-state agency partners, including the Minnesota Nursery and Landscape Association, Conservation Corps, et cetera.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ms. Gauthier. So this amendment, were you aware of the proposal to change the ownership of the work that your agency did before last night, or has there been communication or discussions about changing the ownership of the project that you guys had initiated?
Ms. Gauthier.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Hansen, we were aware of the amendment ample time prior to the committee hearing. As to whether or not there had been discussions prior to that, I was not a part of them at the agency, but I can find out if there had been. As far as I know, though, that we did not know that there was a move afoot until the day before, when we found out, and plenty of time before the committee hearing.
Additional questions? Does anybody want to hear, Mr. Meyer, does anybody want to hear, Representative Hansen, did you want to hear from DNR also?
Yes.
Commissioner Meyer, if you could come down and identify yourself for the record. And Representative Hans. Go ahead, why don't you, I was going too fast last time and ended up making us go slower. So identify yourself for the record, please.
Mr. Chairman, members, for the record, Bob Meyer, Assistant Commissioner, Department of Natural Resources.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, Mr. Meyer, did, if the ownership of this pollution control agency initiated project shifted to the Department of Natural Resources, would you continue to work with the pollution control agency and perhaps the staff who are, who created it?
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Meyer.
Representative Hansen, yes, we've had conversations since the amendment has been posted that both agencies feel we can work through this and work together to achieve the outcomes of the project as listed in the proposal.
Representative Hansen.
And Mr. Chair, does, for both testifiers, would the amendment impair the ability to conduct the project?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gauthier.
And Representative Hansen, I don't believe so. I believe that we can work together to make sure that the goals and objectives of the project are fulfilled.
Additional questions about the amendment or for either testifier? Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I, perhaps Representative Fabian or Torkelson, I just a question of my recollection that being on LCCMR too, wasn't this an education project, or perhaps maybe Ms. Gauthier, that's my recall, that they're going to have young people involved and teaching them about, water quality, et cetera.
Mr.
Ms.
Chairman.
Gauthier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative Purcell. Yes, as I understand it, it was, the MPCA was going to provide a coordinating function. The DNR and Department of Health were going to provide technical assistance, and there was going to be recruitment of volunteers and training of volunteers by some nonprofits in the U of M, industry expertise from MNLA, and then volunteers that would work with the Conservation Corps in some of the activities of planting trees, watering trees, et cetera. Initially in 5 areas throughout the state. Now it's going to be an RFP process for 8 to 12 sites across Minnesota.
Representative Purcell.
Well, Mr. Chairman and colleagues here, I'm concerned, I was concerned about this project at the outset, that if we keep doing this and we have agencies that are going to cooperate and they're going to teach young people about water quality, environmental quality, that we're going to have a new generation here that's going to give a darn. And I think that's a concern that, we need to think about seriously.
Thank you. Additional comments? to the A8. Representative Fabian. You want to renew your motion?
Yeah, I'd like to renew the motion to move the A8 amendment.
Oh, just it's an amendment. You don't even need to
I know
renew your
that.
motion.
I-
All those in-
that's what I thought.
Any further discussion? It's late in the day. We're all ready to go. Okay. All those in favor of the A8 say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Nay. The motion is adopted. Members, we have one more. We have the A10 amendment. I believe it's Representative Newberger's amendment. Representative Newberger to the A10 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move this amendment. Starts on page 17. It's pretty simple. It would delete lines 17.1 to 17.12. And then it would make the adjustment here on page 20, line 10, where we would delete the $1 million amount and we would insert the $2 million amount. That's my amendment.
Thank you. We have one person, Mr. Nordstrom, who's wished to testify. If you could identify yourself for the record and who you represent and give us your testimony.
I will. Thank you. My name is Rolf Nordstrom. I'm the president and CEO of the Great Plains Institute. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit corporation based here in the Twin Cities that works on energy policy and technology. Mr. Chair, members, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and just speak briefly to you about this amendment. I'm here to very respectfully speak against the proposed A10 amendment, and I have just really four main points that I want to offer for you to consider. The Great Plains Institute has been part of a broad stakeholder group kind of leading up to this project that has shaped it and still supports this. It's called the Analysis of Minnesota Energy Systems to Develop Future Energy Strategies. That's the name of the project that's being considered to be dropped. And I acknowledge, I think the stakeholders that have been involved don't now and may never agree on one single energy pathway for the state. But everybody feels like it would be important to better understand what the impacts and trade-offs are of various energy pathways that the state might take. And since this diverse group of stakeholders has already been meeting to think through various energy scenarios going out 35 or more years, this study would really be critical to informing those stakeholder discussions so that they're grounded in science and real analysis. And, you know, we recognize that $1 million is real money, but I guess would argue that it's actually quite modest when you compare it to the billions we spend on energy every year. And, you know, as my dad used to say, this feels like sort of a measure twice and cut once opportunity by doing this study, getting a better bead on how the energy system might evolve in this state, especially given that we don't have a lot of native resources here, at least conventional energy resources. Second main point I'd like to offer is that I think this study would enable the kind of scenario planning that our military and that some of the world's largest companies use routinely to navigate the future. Minnesota has some big energy decisions in front of it in the next, say, 3 decades. So there's really no such thing as doing nothing. And I just, as an example, the nuclear fleet in Minnesota is going to reach the end of those plants will reach the end of their licenses in the early 2030s, 2033, which is going to leave a big gap in our generation. And we're going to need to figure out how best to fill that gap. And I think this kind of study could help us do that. And given the long lifetimes of energy assets and the long lead times you need to plan, now is actually not too soon to be thinking about even the 2030s, even though that may sound far away. Half of Minnesota's coal plants are 40 years old or more, or will be by 2017. And I don't need to tell this body, you probably know it better than I do, that we've had some infrastructure constraints with propane and getting coal where it needs to go just this last year. And the challenge is not that there are not enough of those fuels in the country. The challenge is getting them from where they are to where they're needed in Minnesota. And I think a study like this could help us figure out what are our options for the state being a little less vulnerable to these outside market forces that we don't, frankly, have a lot of control over. Third main point, you know, we believe strongly that interstate and international trade is a great thing. But given that we spend more than $18 billion a year in Minnesota on outside sources of energy, we really think that both the state's economy and our energy security could benefit from at least evaluating whether or not we might use more of our in-state resources to meet a greater proportion of our needs. Maybe put another way, we see this energy study, this energy future study, as being a kind of tool for revealing economic development opportunities in the state that are energy related, and growing an already large advanced energy economy, and as I said, maybe improving our energy security at the same time. And then I guess the final point that I would just ask you to consider, you know, at the end of the day, we really see this energy future study as being a risk management tool, and as a way for the state to figure out how best to hedge against volatile fossil fuel prices. I mean, if you think about natural gas 10 years ago, it was $12 or $14 an MMBTU. You know, now it happens to be $3. But the point is that history has shown that it can be really quite volatile. And of course, the same is true for oil. I mean, it's incredibly cheap at the moment, but does anybody believe that over the next 30, 50 years, it's going to be that cheap? So, you know, Xcel Energy already uses, just as an example, uses wind to hedge against volatile natural gas prices. I guess I'm arguing, I think this kind of study that would look out far enough could help Minnesota as a state hedge also against that volatility. And with that, Mr. Chair, members, thank you again for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Nordstrom. Questions for Mr. Nordstrom? Representative Hornstein.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nordstrom, and I just have a concern about this amendment. I look at it and, you know, what you're doing, and maybe you could comment a little about this, is maximizing energy efficiency. You know, this is something that historically we've all agreed on bipartisanly, that the best and most effective and cheapest and cleanest way to address our energy problem is by conserving it and using it more efficiently. And this is one of the key parts, I understand, of your strategy. So, you know, maybe you could comment a little bit more about this. I was at a Minnesota Environmental Initiative gathering a couple weeks ago, and this was one of the consensus on the panel, is that, you know, this is something we can work together on as a legislature. We haven't, you know, we had this energy efficiency standard in place a few years ago. It's very modest. I think we can do much better than that. So if you could comment a little bit more about your thinking about that question, because you know, why we would not support that is puzzling to me.
Thank you.
Mr. Nordstrom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hornstein, it's a great question. I guess I would say the study, this energy future study, actually doesn't presume any particular generation mix, really even including energy efficiency, although I think the starting assumptions for it are that getting more efficient as an economy would just help us be more competitive. So I think it does assume that energy efficiency will have to increase dramatically over the next, you know, decades. But building on that, I think the value of this is that it would help the state know what its options are in a kind of intellectually honest, dispassionate way, and in a way that's analytically grounded. Again, in the same way that, you know, Royal Dutch Shell made famous this idea of scenario planning, looking at various ways the world could unfold and then trying to figure out what are the strategies they could take as a company that are no regrets, that would position them well no matter which future unfolded. I think this energy study is much the same.
Follow-up, Representative Hornstein.
Well, thank you. I mean, not necessarily for the testifier, but perhaps the author of the amendment, but maybe the others have questions of the testifier, so I could hold off if that's the case.
Okay. Other questions for the testifier? Representative Clark.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Nordstrom, is there anybody else doing this work if we take this money away from you?
Mr. Nordstrom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Clark, do you mean anybody else in Minnesota or anybody else in the nation or
Minnesota?
world?
Well,
Representative
no.
Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, in Minnesota, doing the analysis of the Minnesota energy system.
Mr. Nordstrom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Clark, there is nobody else doing this work in Minnesota. I mean, there are other states that are doing similar kinds of work and other countries doing similar kind of long-term analysis, but nobody in Minnesota really.
Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions for Mr. Nordstrom? Additional question? Representative Newberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Nordstrom, for coming down here. You're on the hot seat, and I appreciate your courage. When I looked at this bill, I just want to be clear that the issue at hand is not the taking one side of the energy issue or the other. Clearly, we have our opinions, and I respect your opinion. I respect your passion in this area. When I look at this, really what we're dealing with is just a limited amount of money that we have to deal with this fund, and where we can best spend it. And so as I kind of unpacked this issue here, and especially this allocation, I got some notes here. This alone, this one grant would consume about 30%, over 30% of the entire 7th subdivision. It's a duplicative study. You said that you weren't sure if anything was done in Minnesota, but then you were real careful because you said really. I mean, you kind of qualified your statement on the end there, which is good because you didn't paint yourself into a corner, and I appreciate that. There have been many studies that have been done, and there are many places where we can have these studies done. There are agencies and groups that are more than willing to facilitate this. The other thing is when I looked at this, so there's really no immediate improvement to our environment with this. Yes, it's another $1 million study, okay? And my thought is why should we spend $1 million for another duplicative type of study, or we can spend $1 million right now and do something very tangible for the environment. And the money would go to Bowser and also to the water districts. And we have a goal of reducing nitrogen in our surface waters by 20% this year. This is an opportunity for us to make a real difference right now. Am I saying that am I saying that your study is a waste of money? Well, we all have opinions, okay? But suffice to say, in the here and now and in the context of what I'm trying to get to, is that we only have a little bit of money, so let's put it to its best use. And in the here and now, giving an additional $1 million to clean up our waters, to me, that's worth the amendment. As far as the studies are concerned, there have been, as Representative Clark kind of touched on, and as you did too, there are many pre-existing opinions that exist already, and there are areas, like I said, that will grant money for this. Right now, the Department of Commerce, they're engaged in doing this. The Citizens League, I did my homework. The Citizens League, they've done multiple studies along these lines. They did one on the 9th of August, 2012. They did one on the 23rd of March, 2004, so they were back doing it then, and also in June of 2008. The Department of Health and the EPA have been deeply involved. I researched your organization, the Great Plains Institute, and you've done a tremendous job with your organization, and you've done quite a bit of work in this area yourself. So my hat's off to you for following your passion there. There are other groups such as Representative Hornstein's involved with Minnesota 350. I researched them as well, and they are very deeply involved in learning and doing studies on this issue. Growth and Justice, that's another group. They did one in October of 2012. The Center for Transportation Studies did one in April of 2012. The EQB did extensive comments about this issue, 9/21 of 11. The Isaac Walton League, January of 2009. I've got a list. I mean, here, I could go through this. I mean, these are all duplicative studies that really cover the same material. I mean, God bless them for doing it. So it's not that there's a lack of information that's out there. Simply just boiling it back to, I'm not here to argue the issue, your side or mine. I'm just saying there's only so much money, and this issue's been researched in depth. So let's take this $1 million and clean up our waters. That's what this is about. Thank you.
Representative Clark.
Well, Mr. Chairman, since I was the one who asked if there was anybody else doing this, I'd just like to give the witness, Mr. Nordstrom, the chance to say if he thinks this is duplicative, but just because you might say it's duplicative, all these different groups by their doing work on this issue, it doesn't make it a duplicate. I want to know the question, just to reiterate it again, is anybody doing this analysis in this way? I don't know how else to say it. Do you think this is duplicative? If it's not, please just state the case of why it's not. I just think we need to know one way or the other. I would just like to get that clarified. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Nordstrom.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Clark, I mean, obviously, that's sort of a tricky question for me, because I wouldn't be here if I thought it was duplicative. So I don't think it is. I appreciate what Representative Newberger says. I think there are lots and lots of studies by lots of different groups on different pieces of the energy question and even the energy future. I think what distinguishes this proposed study is that it wouldn't just be looking at one sector of the energy system. So often a study will look just at the electricity sector or just at transportation or just at heating and cooling. This proposes to look across the entire energy system and to look, not just look out far enough, but to have real sort of engineering level analytical work done so that we really understand in a clearer way, in a more grounded way, what options we have going forward. And I think if it were just a study that was going to sit by itself and collect dust somewhere, I think it wouldn't be worth doing. What the real value I see in the study is to inform this broader public engagement and stakeholder process that's already underway. In other words, a way to inform what those public interests are already talking about, and to see if we could get a broader consensus among Minnesotans on, you know, what are the most promising energy trajectories for the state. And if I may, just even though this is in response to Representative Newberger, and I'm sorry if I'm getting your name wrong.
I get called all kinds of things.
I really appreciate what you said, and I recognize that using the money for this means there's an opportunity cost. I mean, if we use it for this, that means it doesn't go to clean water, and I'm certainly not here to speak against cleaning up our waters. I just think that this is an opportunity to spend still a relatively modest amount of money given the size of the energy system and the sort of long-lived nature of those energy decisions in thinking now about how we're going to fill these generation gaps in the future.
Follow-up, Representative Clark.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just noticed that the language does call for a request for proposals for anyone who wants to do this, and I guess if there were, I mean, that to me is a positive thing. You also talked about community engagement. Can you expand on community engagement? That's not mentioned here that I see.
Mr. Nordstrom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Clark, I mean, I'm in danger here a little bit of putting words in the Legislative Energy Commission's mouth, because they've really been, the responsibility for this study was given to them, and so they've been guiding and shepherding this process. But my understanding is that they're thinking of that public engagement part as having sort of three different parts to it. There's been a leadership team that's been meeting that involved the Chamber of Commerce and Xcel Energy and Cummins Power and others. And then maybe if you think about one concentric circle out from that, the idea is to engage people from around the state in thinking about sort of presenting to them, here are the energy challenges Minnesota is going to face over the next several decades, and beginning to build and providing sort of a common base of information for people to help think about how to address those challenges going forward. And then maybe the furthest out circle, you know, even broader public engagement in a variety of ways, again, to see if we couldn't get sort of a broader consensus in the state on how best to address our energy needs going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, what's your name again?
Rolf Nordstrom.
Nordstrom.
Just think of the department store. Sadly unrelated.
Representative Purcell.
You wouldn't need money then, anyway.
Yeah.
The studies that Representative Newberger referred to, and I'm thinking back to the process we use in LCCMR, and then we evaluate projects as they're brought forward, and there's a review process. And I presume that you're familiar with some of the work that Representative Newberger talked about that's been done by various groups, and we aren't looking for redundancy. And I know that's assessed when we look at LCCMR projects. That, I mean, I don't know if this was a peer review process, but certainly some of these are probably out in jury journals, if you will. But is this is something you're looking to build on, what you know to be a body of evidence that exists right now?
Mr. Nordstrom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Purcell, I mean, I think it's true that there's quite a bit of information on what Minnesota's current energy system looks like, and some various studies that look at, as I said before, particular pieces of it going forward. And this study would obviously build on that, but I think it's just a qualitatively different thing than what's been done before. And, you know, I recognize that when you tell people, in fact, when we were first talking about this idea, if you tell people you want to do a study, it tends to elicit a collective yawn. Like, really? Another study? Is that what the world needs, is another study? I totally get that. But I think that what's different here, as I said, is that it would be not just another analytical study, but connected to this broader engagement process and hold hope for helping to inform people enough that they could help identify what are the most promising paths for Minnesota to take. Because, as I said, you know, we're going to have coal plants getting even older, more than 40 years old, these nuclear plants retiring. We're going to have to figure out as a state how best to fill those gaps. And it seems like now is a good time to be thinking critically and analytically about what the options are for the state. And I think this study would help us do that.
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just I think a final comment, a question too. Arguably, what we do with our energy and how we generate our energy resources can and will impact water quality.
Absolutely. Almost
Mr.
no,
Nordstrom.
I'm sorry, excuse me. Mr. Chair, Representative Purcell, there's actually almost, I can't think of any form of energy that doesn't require water, and both in the production of the energy and in its use. So, and people talk about this sort of water energy nexus, so they're very intimately intertwined.
Representative Purcell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would have to, I'm speaking against the amendment.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your naming these studies, Representative Newberger, and I'm familiar with some, not all of them. And I want to just remind folks that, you know, this is the air quality, climate change, and renewable energy section of this bill. And Representative Newberger, you talked about some of the different, there's other parts of this bill, and you had some concerns about, you know, the amount of money in the study. But it's really appropriate that we do this study in this section of the bill because it relates very closely to these other policies that we're pursuing. And the one study that I don't think you mentioned, which, you know, comes perhaps the closest to what they're doing, but I think this even seems perhaps even more comprehensive, is about 7 years ago, there was the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group. And that looked at all kinds of different sectors. We had business and government and environmental groups with a lot of different stakeholders, and they came up with a number of different recommendations. You know, unfortunately, I think those are way out of date. So much has changed in just in 7 years. You know, the latest IPCC report, that's the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is talking about how this problem is accelerating. And, you know, as Mr. Nordstrom mentioned, we've had just regionally a lot of changes in energy policy. And there's a lot of urgency right now to this whole climate question. So, you know, a 7-year-old study is not going to cut it. And so I think there's a lot of important data that we can glean out of this. You know, I think that it's very timely and again, urgent. And again, I don't think these studies are nearly as comprehensive as you're proposing. And the one we had 7 years ago, we actually had some good policy come out of that. But it's dated. And so much has changed in 7 years, particularly on the climate and energy issues. So I want to emphasize the urgency of doing this and speak against the amendment and for the study because, you know, we really have a lot of important work we have to do. We're falling behind. And the last thing I'll say, Mr. Chair, is we just had the Pollution Control Agency in here last week. And the PCA said, hey, look, we are falling very, very short of our legislatively mandated goals on greenhouse gas reduction. This is a real weakness in our state's environmental policy. The PCA admitted it. And so, again, that's one more reason why we need this and why we need to get this, this issue addressed.
Thank you. Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Nordstrom. I don't know if anyone else has questions for him, but we're talking about the different studies, and I think there's maybe a misperception that you're the person that's going to receive this is going to the Legislative Energy Commission, which we have the Legislative Audit Commission, now the Legislative Water Commission, the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, all these legislative commissions so that they're fair and balanced, equal in terms of their representation, so that we can sort out all the interest groups' studies, all the interest groups' advocacy, from whichever side they're at, that we ask those commissions to set the table for us, because we're here for a couple hours or maybe 45 minutes to discover this, but the process that was put together, one by another legislative commission, was to set the table by vetting and finding out which parts of the menu are going to meet our liking when they bring it here to the legislative process. So, we've been ordering off the menu all day here with this commission, or this committee. We ordered off the menu yesterday, and I respect the advocacy on all the sides of this, but energy, climate change, energy efficiency, these are huge issues for our time. And they really aren't a large portion, comparably, to what's in front of us, because the folks we task with bringing us and setting the table get balanced to have a bill that they can recommend and bring to us. And making a big change like this disrupts that balance. It misses that opportunity to have the relatively newly created Energy Commission come back to us with data that we can trust. So if we're making changes to recommendations all the time, we're going to be the whole question of whether we should have these outside commissions is really up in the question, because we got all the advocacy groups in the room for all the sides. We have all the lobbyists are always here. But we need to be able to have the public interest protected. And that's by doing things in the public, through the process, in a public vein. The lobbyists in the room can always connect with us. They seem to always find us, whether we not want to be found or not. But the Legislative Energy Commission would have the trust that we could put into it to debate this just like we're debating this now. And Mr. Chair, I think I strongly support soil and water conservation districts and have been in it, but they're getting $1 million in here. They're on the menu, but they have the portion that they had asked for. So, Mr. Nordstrom, is there anything like the Legislative Energy Commission in any of the states that you work in where there's a bipartisan, bicameral, balanced commission?
Mr. Nordstrom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hansen, to be honest, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of the legislative arrangements in all the other states, so I can't really give a good answer to that. I would just say that part of the appeal for us, since we're a nonpartisan nonprofit, we definitely do have a point of view on the energy system, and that is that long-term it ought to be both economically and environmentally sustainable. But beyond that, we don't really have a dog in the hunt here. Part of what we liked about the study, and do like about the study, is precisely that it was given to the Legislative Energy Commission, because it felt like it would be exposed to both Republicans and Democrats, it would be an open process because it's a public body, and that whatever came out of it could actually be trusted by the legislature broadly, because it would have been sort of vetted and shepherded by a legislative body. So, as I say, I'm here testifying not because this money is going to come to us, but just because we think it's in the public interest to do this study. And I frankly worry that if we don't do something like this study, we're just going to sort of back into our energy future. We're not really going to shape it. It's just going to happen to us because things are changing so quickly technologically in the energy space.
Thank you. Representative Hanson.
Well, and Mr. Chair and Mr. Nordstrom, if the amendment goes through, there's no dog or hunt, because it's done. And we'd have to wait again. I would, Mr. Chair, when there's done with Mr. Nordstrom with questions, to hear from the Energy Commission. I think they're in the audience, and maybe the SWCDs as well.
Okay, thank you. Representative Poppy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe I may be the only one sitting around the table who actually serves on the Legislative Energy Commission and have for the last 2 years. And I will tell you that it is, and we'll have Ms. Falk come up and describe it maybe a little bit more specifically, but it is a bicameral, bipartisan group of legislators, senators, and representatives. I would say, have quite a spectrum of views and opinions. Representative Newberger talked about this, we can all have our opinions. I would say that, one of the things that, and I will say, I'm not necessarily the strongest advocate of the extremes. I'm kind of trying to find how do we make the most common sense good decisions about energy policy, about the environmental policies, about agricultural policies. I think we need to be able to come together and have good discussion about that. And I will tell you, I think that there are people that serve on that commission that we do have different opinions about things. One of the pieces of this that appeals to me is that this isn't about opinion. That this is about data collection and actually analysis, so that you're coming up with a plan, you're coming up with information, you're doing good background investigation, so you come up with something that can lead to good future policy. And I think that we owe it to ourselves, and frankly, we owe it to my children and grandchildren, that we are doing good public policy long into the future when it comes to agriculture, environment, and energy. And that's again, the appeal of the commission is that it brings together those groups of people that might have an interest in different areas, but it's talking about how can we come up with a good long-term energy policy that we will all be able to hopefully see eye to eye for the most part on. So I appreciate Mr. Nordstrom, Great Plains Institute. I've worked with some of your staff on other issues, and I very much appreciate the work that you do and that they do to promote good policy and good future considerations about how we will sustain our state and the world moving forward. So thank you for being here and for presenting. But I did want to bring the Legislative Energy Commission. I appreciate that Representative Hanson asked Ms. Falk to be able to come down, and if she will be able to just describe how this came to be and maybe a little bit more about the Energy Commission, I'd ask her to do that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. If you could identify yourself for the record and who you represent, and then go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and representatives. My name is Annie Levinson-Falk. I am the Executive Director of the Legislative Energy Commission. That is a nonpartisan staff position of the joint employee of both the House and the Senate. The impetus for this study, as Mr. Nordstrom mentioned, it is a piece of the plan to comply with the duties of the the Legislative Energy Commission, under Minnesota Statute Section 3.8852, which requires the LEC to develop basically a framework for Minnesota's energy future. And I was not here in 2013 when that was passed, but my understanding is that comes from a desire to have better understanding of energy options by legislators and other decision makers, and the likely impacts and trade-offs that are going to go along with some of the choices in front of us. I think the belief was that, as Mr. Nordstrom said, there are a lot of difficult decisions to be made, and legislators wanted to be better informed about those decisions. That at least I can speak for the core team of stakeholders that we have had preparing this, the plan for this study and the associated stakeholder and citizen engagement parts of it. And that is the the motivation behind the organizations that have chosen to participate and the reason that they want to be a part of this framework. To the LEC in general, it is a commission of 10 members of the House, 10 members of the Senate, and it includes legislators who serve on the Energy Committee, Environment and Natural Resources, Agriculture, Transportation, as well as the Next Gen Energy Board. And it's intended to be a body that brings together policy, perspectives, and expertise across all of those areas to think more deeply and more long-term about some of the really difficult energy policy decisions that we have, and to do it in an integrated way across those various policy areas. We do a lot of work during the interim when legislators have a little bit more time to think about bigger picture issues.
Thank you. Follow-up, Representative Poppe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Levinson-Falk, for coming forward and talking about that. I know that early on, you and I had a conversation before I actually got started, and we just talked in depth a little bit about what the kind of the roadmap for the Legislative Energy Commission, and I believe I recall that there wasn't necessarily a determined outcome expected, and what you actually were going to hopefully bring to the table was the opportunity for all of us to be able to be heard and come together. And I appreciate the work that you've done over the last 2 years. And there may be others around the table that are on the commission, but I just appreciate that it's a wide variety of legislators with, again, differing opinions, but I think we came together understanding that we would hear from experts, we would learn about energy policy, and we'd be able to help to determine a good future that would make good common sense and be long-lasting. So I appreciate that you came forward for that. Thank you.
Additional comments? Okay, thank you. Any additional questions? Members, all those in favor of the, excuse me, go ahead. Representative Hanson. Okay, roll call has been requested. McNamara votes aye.
Clark.
No.
Cornish. Dill. Fabian.
Aye.
Fenton.
Aye.
Fisher. Green. Hackbarth.
Aye.
Hancock.
Aye.
Hanson.
No.
Hausman.
No.
Heinzman.
Aye.
Hornstein.
No.
Johnson.
No.
Newberger.
Aye.
Purcell.
No.
Poppe.
No.
Rarick.
Aye.
Torkelson.
Aye.
Uglum.
Aye.
There being 11 ayes and 7 nays, the amendment is adopted. To the bill, any additional question? Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd ask for a roll call on the bill and have a couple comments.
Go ahead, Representative Hanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and, you know, I'd mentioned this in my earlier comments, but we're at now, I think, 3 or 4 substantive changes to the LCCMR bill. We task these commissions to do the work and present us with options based on the work of hearing each of these in depth. We have in the past changed recommendations. I think when our side of the aisle's been in charge, we've maybe changed one time each bill. But this is quite a bit of change, quite a bit of money, but also moving away from dealing with clean energy, one of the most important issues of our time, both in terms of the climate, but also in terms of money. I mean, I just saw a blurb today that our sister state that we were told we should be emulating with oil, has got a $4 billion hole in their budget because of the drop in oil revenues. So balancing the budgets, dealing with energy, dealing with what the future is going to look like. This last amendment was really a mistake. There were other mistakes during the day. I know that this bill will pass and it will go, but I don't think it's the right thing to do in terms of the content that was changed, not only the process, but the content of the things that were changed. Sets a bad precedent, but also we're missing opportunities to look at our environment, our energy future, our water quality. We abandoned, I guess we abandoned the turtles. We abandoned the Raptor Center. And now we're abandoning looking at data for clean energy. So I would encourage a no vote on the bill.
Additional comments? Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to be voting for the bill, but it's, I want to express a disappointment. I'm new to the Finance Committee, and relatively new in the House. And so this is a learning experience for me. And my disappointments are basically two. One is that I got to believe that these projects were better vetted by the LCCMR in their processes than what we're doing today. And I genuinely value the input and the knowledge and the experience of the people who sit on that committee, especially the citizens who are involved. And we've walked away from them. But I'm also deeply disappointed by, we're walking away from knowledge. The case of the energy study, that makes good sense. And so rarely can we put together and have the long view. As I age, I more appreciate the long view. And I think too often in politics and in the House, we find ourselves in the short-term view. And I find myself wanting to see more of the long-term view. And we walked away from that just a few moments ago. And earlier today, I thought the turtle study was excellent. It reminds me of, and granted, it's a small study and all that, but it wasn't that long ago when there was a bunch of high school students up in Henderson, Minnesota, who discovered some frogs that didn't look right. And it really led to an extensive study about frogs being, in this case, another canary in the coal mine, whereby their ecosystem, the ecology related to that, really raised some questions about what we were doing environmentally. And those frogs were important, and those are just little frogs discovered by high school students. I think the students at St. Thomas could have really helped us understand, by observing the turtles, is there an impact on what they're seeking to study? And I think we're making a mistake by doing that. I'll admit that a major part of my motivation for voting for this bill is that they're moving some bison over to Minneopa State Park, which is in my backyard. And that is the kind of progressive thing we need to do, whereby we're splitting a very important herd of bison. One of the most natural herds in America, and we're actually protecting the value of that genetic base by splitting it up from Blue Mountain and sending some of them over to Minneopa State Park. But I'll be voting for it, but again, I'll be disappointed.
Thank you. Representative Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the members of the committee for their hard work today. We have substantially, this bill is substantially the way it came out of the LCCMR. We've made some changes that are appropriate in most of our eyes. It's still a very good bill supporting great projects all across the state of Minnesota. I renew my motion that the bill be re-referred to the Committee on Government Operations.
And that's House File 390 as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Clerk will call the roll. McNamara votes aye.
Clark.
No.
Cornish.
Aye.
Dill. Fabian.
Aye.
Fenton.
Aye.
Fisher. Green. Hackbart.
Aye.
Hancock.
Aye.
Hanson.
No.
Hausman.
No.
Heinzman.
Aye.
Hornstein.
No.
Johnson.
Aye.
Newberger.
Aye.
Purcell. Poppy.
No.
Rarick.
Aye.
Torkelson.
Aye.
Uglum.
Aye.
Both Representative Green and Representative Dill were excused for this afternoon's meeting.
Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry, Representative Hanson, was there one more member excused?
Peter Fisher was, and I think he was excused when we
Yes.
were in session, so I want to make sure he's,
And I apologize, I was trying to think of who else it was. Thank you. So all three members have been excused. There being 13 ayes and 5 nays, the bill is passed and re-referred to GovOps. Thank you, members, for coming back this afternoon. We'll be back in this committee Tuesday morning. We're adjourned.